Greetings and welcome. We're now we're reading from the book of Journey, and you're looking at Ruka, our dear doggie. She's a little somber. She just had a bath. Ruka, you want to say hi? Hello. How are you? So this is sweet Ruka that I've told you about. She's a sweet girl. So she and I are listening to Sergeant Pepper's, which is in fact the first album that I ever actually bought. Hey, rookie. So let's see if we can set this up to read the book here. We'll make this a little bit smaller. All right. Welcome. So now you've met Ruka. She's a good doggy. So what else is new? I think there were other things to tell you today. Let's see. I've been out digging a trench all morning next to our fence because we have a neighbor dog who likes to dig a lot. So finally we're going to see if we can't dig a nice ditch on our side and put in railroad ties and help discourage her from digging. I've also invited her and her owner for a walk in the woods. I think she'd be one happy dog to. Part of the reason she's digging is because she wants to go walking in the woods with Rook and I. So we talked to her owner yesterday. We'll see about that. So in the meantime, let's see here. Oh, I'll probably be turning the music off again. I'll definitely do that. Yeah, Sergeant Pepper's. I remember walking out to McCord Air Force Base to the PX and buying this album. Actually, we're listening to a CD right now, but I still have the album. I really like listening to the old albums. We've still used Carol's Panasonic turntable she had when we got married, and it's kind of a combination. You have to know the secret code to make it work between the volume and the balance, but it works. One of these days maybe we'll find a used turntable somewhere, but it's hung in there pretty good for a lot of years. All right, so let's turn off the Beatles. All right, so I'm moving kind of slow after digging today. But it's good. It's all ready for railroad ties now tomorrow out there. So Roaches in New Jersey, chapter 16. If you heard the last chapter, you know that Carol and I got married. And once Carol and I actually had our marriage, well, actually we hadn't got married yet, but we were getting there. Once Carol and I actually had our marriage license in hand, we did call the airline and change our flight from Thursday to Sunday. After the wedding and after a very quick Saturday night honeymoon at a lovely little waterfront cabin on Hood Canal, it was Sunday and it was time to fly. Upon our return to Denver, we had about a week to get Carol moved out of her apartment, load up her Datsun B10 or B210, my trusty Oldsmobile, and a little U-Haul trailer filled with all our stuff, get her finished up at the job with the newspaper. She didn't even have time to give them a 2-week notice. and start our road trip to New Jersey. We also had just enough time for our wonderful friends and family in the Denver area to surprise us with a little reception. 1,600 miles on the road with houseplants sticking out of the windows of Carol's car, one blowout on the U-Haul, and a few days of communicating car to car by walkie-talkie, we made it to Fort Dix, New Jersey. I'd been assigned to work as a nurse in the 6-bed cardiac care medical intensive care unit at Walson Army Hospital. This critical care unit was definitely the best and most interesting place to work in the whole hospital. The thing is, when the sergeant in charge of placing new nurses in their new jobs asked me where I would most like to work, I replied, anywhere other than the intensive care. Truth is, as a new nurse, I was intimidated by the idea of taking care of the complex and critical patients. Turns out I ended up being so glad that the good sergeant wasn't swayed by my fears and chose to assign me to the one place I didn't want to go. Fort Dix was a training post that had been around probably since at least World War I, and perhaps longer than that. As a result, the family housing for a low-ranking NCO like myself, I was promoted from Specialist 4th Class to Sergeant E5 shortly after we arrived at Fort Dix, was anything but modern. It would probably be fair to say that the brick row house style sixplex we were provided to live in was pretty old. Don't get me wrong, I like old. Today, old can sometimes even be called rustic or vintage. In the case of our housing, it was just old. Because of the old construction, there were no firewalls in the attic between the units. This might not be a problem unless, of course, you had a fire. Or unless you had an infestation of roaches. My lord, I had never seen so many roaches. With the exception of a few giant cockroaches in Hawaii, when I was a little kid and we went to visit my Uncle Bill and Aunt Nancy, I hadn't really seen any. That all changed at Fort Dix. We sprayed, we powdered, we bombed, we did it all. The problem, though, is that no matter what you did to get rid of these nasty little creatures, if all the occupants of the building weren't trying to control the problem, the bugs would just travel next door via the attic for a little holiday. When the fog cleared, they would come back home. It's a good thing that Carol and I weren't trying to start a family while living in the brick row house haven for roaches. With all the pesticides we used, it probably wasn't a safe place for us, much less for a baby. We would place roach hotels in all our cupboards, and within no time at all, the little boxes would be full. Additional guests of the hotels would just crawl in one side and out the other, walking over the carcasses of their friends and family. We knew we were in big trouble when Carol pulled out a can of killer foam and blasted an amazingly bold little roach that was walking across our living room floor in the middle of the day. Some people will tell you that roaches only come out at night. Not so, not in New Jersey. This little fellow crawled out from under the pile of foamy poison and just kept on trucking as if nothing had happened. He might have even flipped us off. It was a little something like something out of the Twilight Zone. Kind of scary. Before marrying me, Carol never really had much to do with the military. Her introduction to military life started with marrying a military guy in 3 days from proposal to marriage. Then, immediately drive across country with her new military husband, 2 cars and all her worldly possessions in a little U-Haul, move into old military housing, and have a bad roach problem as a special bonus. I'm so glad she decided to hang in there as opposed to packing up and moving back to Colorado, which did cross her mind, seriously. Instead, Carol chose to learn the military way, how to improvise, adapt, and overcome. I loved our little house. After some paint and wallpaper and flowers growing in the garden, it was a wonderful place. We just needed to get rid of those nasty roaches. I really appreciate that my lovely wife has got some grit. Not knowing that it was against Army regulations to circulate a petition, Carol and another military wife who lived in the neighborhood and who had the same bug problem that we did went door to door throughout the housing complex circulating a petition and getting signatures from all the folks being plagued by roaches. The petition, although not officially legal to circulate, made its way to the desk of the general of Fort Dix. It wasn't so very long before an exterminating company came out and fumigated the whole housing area from top to bottom. They went through our building, spraying their pesticide from one end to the other. When the guy came out of the last apartment and took off his face mask and respirator, he, with eyes as big as saucers, said, "I've never seen anything like that." All the roaches that didn't die along the way ended up in the last unit. I looked through the kitchen window and was gagged to see what I saw. The floor and countertops and tabletop were all black because they were covered with dead and dying roaches. It was nasty. The moral of the story, however, is that because of Carol and the other concerned and involved military wife, we had the roach problem taken care of. Oh, and there was also the time before the neighborhood-wide fumigation when Carol brought a bag full of dead roaches to a quarterly community meeting. I don't think the baggie made its way to the general, but it did get into the hands of the executive officer of the post, who was a full bird colonel and who was also attending. At another meeting, Carol brought a carefully composed letter describing how we had performed the nasty task of catching and killing a huge rat that had been living in our home. On several occasions, we'd caught a glimpse of this thing, but didn't really know just how huge it was. One evening, we decided to go out to dinner, but before leaving, I baited a big rat trap and left it on the kitchen floor. When we returned and opened the front door, it was the weirdest thing because you could clearly hear what sounded like a heartbeat going at about 300 times a minute. I went into the kitchen to find a monster rat caught in the trap. Both rat and trap started flipping over and over on the floor, and yes, it was the rat's heartbeat that we were hearing. I won't tell you here the method I used to put Mr. Rat out of his misery, but I know they heard all about it at the meeting. We weren't sure if the general of Fort Dix appreciated Carol's enthusiastic participation in the community or if he was just glad to see her go. But shortly before we left New Jersey, she received a letter of appreciation worthy of framing, signed by the good general himself. Carol was underwhelmed. My bride did grow to love our first little home together once the roaches and the rat were gone. Fort Dix was a perfect location from which to travel into Pennsylvania or into New York. We made several trips to both. The East Coast is so incredibly rich in culture, tradition, and history, and we tried to travel whenever possible. It was always a lot of fun to go into Old Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, or to Lancaster County, home of the Mennonites, and also to travel into Manhattan for a weekend. While in New York City, because I was a service member, we could take advantage of the USO, which provided all kinds of wonderful and much appreciated perks. Goodies ranging from early morning coffee and pastries to free tickets for off-Broadway plays. We had a chance to see Country Girl with Hal Holbrook. That was pretty cool. During one of our trips to New York, we traveled up near Woodstock and stayed with my old buddy Rolf and his wife Enika. Rolf had met his lovely Dutch wife to be Enika while living at Nessamine. They were later married and spent some time living near Rolf's parents' home in New York. I was also able to show Carol around West Point and to introduce her to my dear friends Dave and Jane at Cornwall on Hudson. Our 2 years living in New Jersey really were a wonderful time. Carol found a job near the Post with a little publishing company, which, in addition to volunteering in the office for the Post chaplain, in conjunction with her enthusiastic community involvement, kept Carol pretty busy and helped us soften any homesickness that she may have been feeling for Colorado. And she really was. As our time at Fort Dix, along with my military enlistment, was quickly approaching a conclusion, Carol and I had both determined that a long-term career in the military was not our plan for the future. As a result, I was not intending to re-enlist. Having worked in the critical care unit, along with doing some time in the emergency room, both at Walson Hospital and Nuremberg Hospital in Germany, I discovered that I had an undeniable interest in and desire to continue working within emergent intensive care medicine. My vision, however, was not to work in the hospital setting, but instead to pursue paramedic school. While still living in New Jersey, I started checking out and contacting different medic programs in Washington State, which is where Carol and I were planning to go once I was out of the Army. Although my superiors had been made very aware that I was not intending to re-enlist, they nonetheless advised me that I'd been slotted to attend a several week-long leadership course that was necessary for promotion. After completing and even doing pretty well in a majority of the course, a couple other soldiers and I were kind of vying back and forth for the number one position. I was notified that my father had experienced a major heart attack and was receiving treatment in the cardiac care unit. I contacted and spoke with one of the physicians caring for Dad and learned that his prognosis was uncomfortably uncertain. We decided that I should request to withdraw from the leadership course so Carol and I could get to Washington as quickly as possible. Although I had no burning desire or intentions of redoing the course, I could if I chose to. Carol and I did make it to Washington within a couple days of hearing about my dad. We stayed for a week or so, and until we felt confident that he was doing well, and best we could tell was going to be okay. Dad did recover from the heart attack, but it would turn out that there was another medical problem nobody knew about, which would soon be revealing its ugly head. As the months went by, I became more and more intent on attending paramedic school, and had in fact applied for the program being held at Central Washington University in Ellensburg. As is so often the case, it sometimes really does matter who you know. Central Washington's paramedic program had been established by and was directed by Miss Dorothy Purser. In addition to being professor of physical education at the college, Dorothy was also a pioneer of paramedic education, not just at CWU, but throughout Washington State. It just so happened that Dorothy was also a friend of my brother Frank, who was a state patrolman in Ellensburg. And Dorothy had also taught my niece Dawn Marie how to swim. Rumor has it that Dorothy's swim class teaching method was to start by throwing you in the pool. After getting to know Dorothy, I could believe it. Although some written testing and a couple interviews were necessary to be invited to CWU's paramedic program, I'm pretty sure it didn't hurt for me to have my brother Frank putting in a good word, probably on several occasions, to the director of the program. Just a few months prior to my military discharge date, Carol and I received the horrible news that Dad was once again in the hospital. This time, however, it was not for his heart, but due to an aggressive lung cancer that had rapidly metastasized to his brain. We were advised that under circumstances like these, and because I was quite near to my discharge date, I could request an early release from the Army. This would mean leaving the assignment at Fort Dix in order to be home with Dad and finishing up what other little bit of enlistment time I had with the reserve unit back in Washington. We chose to take advantage of this option and started making arrangements to go. As much as I would have loved to hang on to the wonderful old Oldsmobile, she was beginning to get pretty tired and probably wouldn't have made the trip across country. My faithful Olds 88 had been one of the best cars ever, but would now become the possession of a local mechanic we'd come to know and who I felt fairly confident would take good care of her. This time, instead of dragging a U-Haul trailer, we just let the Army take care of shipping our stuff for us. We loaded up Carol's little Datsun with our essentials, said thank you and goodbye to Fort Dix and to New Jersey, and set out for Washington. Within just weeks after our return to Washington State, Dad passed away. My father truly was one of the very best and finest people I've ever known. As much as I hate the fact that Carol and I weren't given more time with him on this earth, I even more regret that our 3 children never got to know their grandpa and to experience and appreciate what a wonderful grandfather he would have been to them. I've mentioned that Dad seldom went to church while we were growing up, and that he used to say he didn't want to be a hypocrite. It wasn't until several years later, after Dad and I had both gone through some changes, that I may have understood a little better what he meant. In my case, I needed to learn that it wasn't a cause and effect sort of thing where the good things I did or the bad things I didn't do would incontrovertibly dictate the kind of relationship I'd be able to have with Jesus or not. Rather, it was totally because of his love and grace for me and for the world that I was able to have a relationship with him at all. It wasn't about what I did, but about what he had done. Likewise, I think Dad may have had a similar sort of works mentality that led him to believe that neither he nor many of the people in the church were worthy. He didn't want to pretend that he was. During one of our conversations after I'd returned from Israel for the second time, Dad commented that he just couldn't see how someone like Hitler, for instance, could ever go to heaven, whether he was truly sorry and truly asked forgiveness for the things he had done or not. The idea of that kind of unconditional love and grace from God was just too big to grasp. Considering that Dad had experienced World War II and some of its horrors firsthand, I can see why this would be a very difficult concept. Probably due to all the years of seeing and enjoying the kind of supernatural, unconditional love that Mom displayed, I believe that Dad's heart genuinely went through a change in this. I believe that he really did come to understand that the love and life that Jesus gives is an undeserved gift and isn't dependent on what we do or don't do. For the last few years of Dad's life, he was often accompanying my mom to church and enjoying time together with all those other dysfunctional members of God's family, ones like me. So that concludes chapter 16. I think we're going to leave it at that, and next time we'll be doing Anywhere But Yakima, chapter 17. Like always, appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we'll look forward to seeing you again probably next week. Adios.